In the winter of 1851, a teacher named Elizabeth Hartwell made a discovery in the basement of St. Catherine's Academy for young ladies that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Behind a false wall in what appeared to be an abandoned storage room, she found 24 small beds, each with iron shackles still attached to the headboards. Beside each bed lay a single possession, a torn doll, a faded ribbon, a small wooden cross. On the wall, written in what appeared to be a child's desperate scroll, were the words, "We are still here." The Massachusetts authorities buried Elizabeth's report so deep that it didn't surface again until 1987 when renovation workers found her original testimony sealed in a mason jar behind the Academy's altar. What they discovered about the fate of those 24 orphan girls would reveal one of New England's most carefully guarded secrets, a secret that 3 women calling themselves nuns had killed to protect. Before we continue with the story of St. Catherine's Academy, I need to tell you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to uncover the darkest secrets that history tried to bury. If you're one of the few who can handle the truth about what really happened in that Massachusetts Academy, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And I want to know, comment below and tell me what state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to hear what happened to those 24 girls? Let's find out together. But first, we need to understand how a place of supposed sanctuary became a house of horrors. The year was 1834, and Massachusetts was experiencing unprecedented growth. The Industrial Revolution had transformed cities like Boston and Worcester into bustling centers of commerce, but it had also created a darker problem. Thousands of orphan children with nowhere to go. Salem, Massachusetts in 1834 was a city, still carrying the weight of its infamous past, while the witch trials were nearly a century and a half behind. The people of Salem remained deeply religious and suspicious of anything that seemed unusual or out of place. The Congregationalist churches dominated the religious landscape there, stark white steeples reaching toward gray New England skies like accusing fingers. It was in this atmosphere of rigid puritanical devotion that St. Catherine's Academy for me, young ladies, was established on Gallows Hill Road, a location that seemed almost mockingly appropriate given what would later transpire there. The Academy occupied an imposing 3-story brick building that had once served as a private mansion for a wealthy merchant family. Its Gothic Revival architecture with tall, narrow windows and steep gable roofs gave an air of respectability that would prove to be nothing more than an elaborate facade. The Academy advertised itself as a Christian institution dedicated to the moral and educational development of orphan young ladies ages 12 to 17. The promotional materials printed on expensive paper and distributed throughout New England promised refinement in manners, excellence in domestic arts, and careful placement in respectable Christian households. Parents who had died of consumption, cholera, or industrial accidents could rest easy knowing their daughters would be well cared for at St. Catherine's. The woman who presented herself as Mother Superior Victoria Whitman was a figure of imposing authority, tall and severe, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun beneath her black habit. She commanded respect wherever she went. In Salem, her voice carried the cultured accent of Boston's Beacon Hill, and she spoke eloquently about her calling to serve God's most vulnerable children. She claimed to have been educated at the prestigious Mount Holyoke Female Seminary and to have served in Catholic orphanages in Ireland before coming to Massachusetts. Sister Margaret Collins appeared to be Whitman's perfect complement, younger, with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put frightened orphan girls at ease. She taught literature and music, and her soft Irish accent reminded many of the girls of mothers they had lost. Children who arrived at St. Catherine's traumatized and grieving found in Sister Margaret a maternal figure who seemed to genuinely care about their welfare. The third member of their Holy Trinity was Sister Agnes Murphy, a stern woman in her 40s who served as the Academy's disciplinarian and business manager. She handled all correspondence with families seeking to adopt managed the academies, finances, and maintained the strict daily schedule that governed every aspect of the girls' lives. Her habit was always spotless, her rosary always at her side, and her word was law within. The academy's walls. The people of Salem welcomed St. Catherine's Academy with open arms. Here, finally, was a solution to the growing problem of orphan children. The Congregationalist ministers praised the work being done, despite their theological differences with Catholicism. After all, these women were caring for children that the Protestant community had struggled to accommodate. The mayor of Salem himself attended the Academy's dedication ceremony in September 1834, praising Mother Superior, Whitman's Christian charity and maternal devotion. The girls who arrived at St. Catherine's came from across New England. There was Mary O'Brien, 13 years old, whose parents had died in a factory fire in Lell. Sarah Thompson, 15, had been orphan when consumption claimed her entire family in a tenement building in Boston. Little Catherine Murphy, no relation to Sister Agnes, was only 12 when her father died in a railroad accident, and her destitute mother could no longer care for her. Each girl who arrived was given the same welcome, a hot meal, a clean bed, and the promise of a better future. They were told they would receive an education that would prepare them to be teachers, governesses, or wives to respectable men. Most importantly, they were told that when they reached 18, the sisters would help them find placement with fine Christian families, who would provide them with opportunities they never could have imagined. The daily routine at St. Catherine's was rigorous but not unusual for the time. The girls rose before dawn for morning prayers, attended classes in reading, writing, arithmetic, and domestic skills throughout the day, and ended each evening with devotional study. They wore simple gray dresses and white aprons, their hair pulled back in modest styles. They learned to embroider, to manage a household, to cook simple meals, and to conduct themselves as proper Christian ladies. From the outside, St. Catherine's Academy appeared to be everything it claimed to be. The few visitors who were allowed inside saw well-behaved girls engaged in their studies, clean dormitories with simple but adequate furnishings, and devoted, religious women who had sacrificed worldly pleasures to serve God's children. When local ministers or government officials visited, they saw exactly what Mother Superior Whitman wanted them to see. But there were things that visitors didn't see. They didn't see the third floor of the building, which was always kept locked and was explained as storage for seasonal items. They didn't see the basement workshop, where, according to Mother Superior Whitman, the girls learned advanced domestic skills, a workshop that was always empty when visitors were present. They didn't notice that while new girls regularly arrived at the academy, none of the long-time residents seemed to be aging out of the program. Most importantly, they didn't question why in 17 years of operation, not a single girl who had been placed with a Christian family had ever written a friend still at the academy or returned for a visit, or been seen anywhere in Massachusetts again. The first sign that something was terribly wrong at St. Catherine's Academy came not from within its walls, but from a completely unexpected source. A young woman named Emma Prescott, who worked as a seamstress in Boston's North End. It was a cold February morning in 1843, nearly 9 years after Themy's founding, when Emma was walking to work through the narrow streets near the harbor. As she passed an alley between two brick tenements, she heard something that stopped her in her tracks. A young voice, singing a lullaby that she recognized immediately. It was a song that her friend Mary O'Brien used to sing at the textile mill where they had both worked before Mary's parents died in the fire. Emma followed the sound to a small window on the second floor of a building that she knew by its reputation to be one of Boston's most notorious brothels. The window was covered with heavy curtains, but through a small gap she caught a glimpse of a young woman with dark hair and familiar features. Even after 3 years, Emma was certain she was looking at Mary O'Brien, the same Mary O'Brien who was supposed to be living happily with a Christian family somewhere in Massachusetts. What Emma saw in that brief moment would haunt her forever. Mary, if it was indeed Mary, appeared to be wearing a silk dress that was far too sophisticated for a girl of 16. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that seemed completely at odds with the modest orphan girl Emma remembered. But it was Mary's eyes that disturbed Emma most. They held a hollow, distant expression that spoke of experiences no child should ever endure. Emma stood frozen in that alley for several minutes, trying to convince herself that she had been mistaken. But the lullaby continued, and the voice was unmistakably Mary's. When Emma finally gathered the courage to approach the building's front door, she was met by a large man who made it clear that respectable young ladies had no business in that part of town. That evening, Emma wrote a letter to St. Catherine's Academy addressing it to Mary O'Brien and asking about her friend's welfare. She mentioned that she thought she had seen Mary in Boston and wondered if she might be visiting the city. Emma expected a prompt reply explaining that Mary was well and happy with her adoptive family, perhaps even including a letter from Mary herself. Instead, Emma received a response that chilled her to the bone. Sister Agnes Murphy wrote back within a week, but her letter raised more questions than it answered. She thanked Emma for her concern, but explained that Mary O'Brien had been placed with a devout family in western Massachusetts more than 2 years earlier. The family, she wrote, had specifically requested privacy and did not wish to maintain correspondence with Mary's former acquaintances. Sister Agnes added that Mary was thriving in her new environment and had expressed her desire to focus entirely on her new life. The letter's tone was formal and final, clearly meant to discourage any further inquiries. But Emma noticed something odd about the handwriting. Having worked as a seamstress, she had developed a keen eye for detail, and she was certain that the letter had been written by 2 different people. The main text appeared to be in Sister Agnes's careful script, but the signature at the bottom looked different, more hurried, as if someone else had signed Sister Agnes' name. Emma might have let the matter drop, but 3 months later, she had another disturbing encounter. While shopping at Faneuil Hall, she saw a well-dressed gentleman leading a young girl by the arm toward a waiting carriage. The girl was perhaps 14 years old with light brown hair and freckles across her nose. Emma was almost certain she recognized her as Sarah Thompson, another girl from St. Catherine's Academy who was supposed to have been adopted by a loving family. But this girl wasn't dressed like the daughter of a respectable family. Her clothing was expensive but inappropriate for a child her age, the kind of clothing Emma had seen on women in the more questionable establishments near the waterfront. The girl's eyes held the same hollow expression Emma had seen in Mary's face, and she moved with the listless compliance of someone who had learned not to resist. Emma tried to approach them, but the gentleman, a man in his 50s with a bearing of wealth and authority, hurried the girl into the carriage before Emma could get close enough to speak. As the carriage pulled away, Emma caught a glimpse of the girl's face pressed against the window. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Emma saw something that made her stomach turn, a desperate plea for help that the girl dared not voice. That night, Emma made a decision that would put her own life in danger. She wrote a second letter to St. Catherine's Academy, this time asking more direct questions. She mentioned seeing both Mary and Sarah in Boston, and she asked Sister Agnes to provide specific information about where the girls had been placed. She also asked if it might be possible to visit the academy to inquire about other girls she had known. The response came not from Sister Agnes, but from Mother Superior, Whitman herself. The letter was brief and polite, but its message was unmistakably threatening. Mother Superior Whitman wrote that Emma's continued inquiries were disturbing the peace of mind of girls who have found happiness in their new lives. She suggested that Emma's imagination might be leading her to see familiar faces where none existed, and she strongly advised that Emma focus on her own circumstances rather than dwelling on the past. The letter concluded with words that Emma would never forget. Young women who persist in pursuing matters that do not concern them often find that their own safety and reputation may be called into question. I trust that a sensible girl, like yourself, will understand the wisdom of allowing sleeping dogs to lie. Emma understood the threat perfectly, but she also understood that she had stumbled upon something far more sinister than a simple case of miscommunication. Two girls who were supposed to be living with Christian families were instead appearing in circumstances that suggested a fate far worse than orphanhood. The question that tormented Emma was how many other girls from St. Catherine's Academy had met the same fate, and more importantly, what could she possibly do about it without putting herself in mortal danger? Emma Prescott's discovery would have remained nothing more than a troubling suspicion if not for a series of events that began to unfold in the autumn of 1847. By this time, St. Catherine's Academy had been operating for 13 years, and Mother Superior Whitman had become one of Salem's most respected religious figures. She was frequently invited to speak at Congregationalist churches throughout Massachusetts, where she would deliver moving sermons about the Christian duty to care for orphan children. But success had made the three women careless, and their operation had grown far beyond what they could safely manage. What had begun as a small-scale scheme had evolved into something much larger and more dangerous. They were no longer simply placing a few girls with questionable families. They had become the primary suppliers for a network of brothel and private collectors that stretched from Boston to New York City. The turning point came when they made a fatal error in judgment. In October 1847, a wealthy merchant named Cornelius Blackwood approached Mother Superior Whitman with a request that should have raised immediate red flags. Blackwood claimed to be seeking a young companion for his allegedly invalid wife, someone who could provide comfort and assistance with daily tasks. He was willing to pay an extraordinary sum, nearly 5 times what legitimate adoptive families typically contributed to the Academy. Blackwood's story was suspicious from the beginning. He claimed to live in a remote area of western Massachusetts, but his clothing and manner suggested someone accustomed to city life. He spoke of his wife's illness in vague terms and seemed reluctant to provide specific details about his household. Most troubling of all, he insisted on meeting potential candidates in private, claiming that his wife's delicate condition required absolute discretion. A legitimate religious institution would have refused such a request, but Mother Superior Whitman saw only the financial opportunity. She arranged for Blackwood to meet 3 of her girls, 15-year-old Catherine Murphy, 14-year-old Elizabeth Porter, and 16-year-old Hannah Clark. All 3 were described as particularly lovely and well-behaved qualities that had made them valuable commodities in the Academy's true business. What Mother Superior Whitman didn't know was that Cornelius Blackwood didn't exist. The man calling himself Blackwood was actually Detective Inspector William Ashworth of the Boston Police Department, working undercover on a case that had been developing for months. The investigation had begun when the body of a young woman was pulled from Boston Harbor in the summer of 1847. The victim appeared to be about 18 years old, with dark hair and delicate features that suggested she had once been well cared for. What made the case unusual was a small tattoo on the girl's wrist, a simple cross with the letters SC beneath it. Detective Ashworth had seen similar markings before, always on young women found dead in circumstances that suggested they had been involved in prostitution. But these particular markings were different. They appeared to be amateur work, the kind of tattoo that might be applied by someone without professional skill. More importantly, the SC initials suggested an institutional connection that went beyond simple street-level prostitution. Ashworth's investigation had led him through Boston's underground network of brothel and private clubs catering to wealthy men with particular tastes. What he discovered was a carefully organized system that provided young girls to clients who were willing to pay premium prices for what they called fresh inventory. The girls in this network were not typical street prostitutes. They were educated, well-mannered young women who had been trained to serve the specific needs of Boston's elite. The trail had eventually led Ashworth to St. Catherine's Academy, but not through any direct evidence. Instead, he had noticed a pattern in the missing persons reports that crossed his desk. Over the past 13 years, dozens of young women had simply vanished from Massachusetts without a trace. They weren't runaways from troubled families. They were girls who had been placed in what appeared to be legitimate institutions or adoptive homes, only to disappear completely. When Ashworth began investigating these disappearances more closely, he found that an unusually high number of them had connections to St. Catherine's Academy. Girls who had been successfully placed with Christian families were never seen again, never wrote letters to friends, never appeared in marriage, records, or death certificates. It was as if they had been erased from existence. The undercover operation at St. Catherine's was Ashworth's attempt to gather evidence of what he suspected was a sophisticated trafficking operation. What he found when he met with Mother Superior Whitman exceeded his worst expectations. During their private meeting in the Academy's parlor, Mother Superior Whitman spoke openly about the qualities that made certain girls more valuable than others. She emphasized their youth, their innocence, and their complete dependence on the Academy for their survival. She hinted that clients with particular requirements could be accommodated, and she made it clear that discretion was guaranteed as long as the price was right. When Ashworth asked to see the girls she had mentioned, Mother Superior Whitman led him not to the main dormitory where visitors were usually taken, but to a separate wing of the building that he had not seen before. This area was noticeably different from the rest of the Academy. The rooms were smaller and more luxuriously appointed with silk curtains and fine furniture that seemed completely out of place in an orphanage. The three girls who were brought to meet Cornelius Blackwood were dressed in clothing that was far too sophisticated. For orphans, their hair was styled in elaborate fashions, and they wore cosmetics that enhanced their youthful beauty. Most disturbing of all, they had been trained to present themselves in ways that were clearly designed to appeal to adult men with predatory interests. Detective Ashworth realized that he was looking at girls who had been systematically groomed for sexual exploitation, but what he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his career. As he was leaving the Academy, Ashworth caught sight of another part of the building that Mother Superior Whitman had not shown him. Through a window, he glimpsed what appeared to be a workshop where several young women were engaged in some kind of manual labor. But these weren't the happy, well-cared-for students he had been shown earlier. These girls looked exhausted and defeated, working in silence under the watchful eye of Sister Agnes Murphy. Ashworth realized that St. Catherine's Academy was operating on multiple levels. There were the girls who were being prepared for placement with wealthy clients, girls who received special treatment and training. There were the girls who were used for manual labor within the Academy itself. And based on the evidence he had gathered, there were girls who simply disappeared when they were no longer useful to the operation. The question that now faced Detective Ashworth was how to build a case against three women who had spent 13 years building reputations as devoted servants of God. They had the support of Salem's religious community, the respect of government officials, and the protection that came from serving what appeared to be a noble cause. But Ashworth had one advantage that Mother Superior Whitman didn't know about. Emma Prescott had finally found the courage to approach the Boston police with her suspicions. Her testimony, combined with the evidence Ashworth had gathered undercover, would form the foundation of a case that would expose one of New England's most carefully guarded secrets. Detective Ashworth knew that exposing the truth about St. Catherine's Academy would require more than his undercover observations and Emma Prescott's testimony. He needed irrefutable evidence, and he needed witnesses who could testify to what they had seen. The problem was that the operation had been designed to eliminate witnesses, and anyone who might have knowledge of the Academy's true activities had either been silenced or was too terrified to speak. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Nathaniel Webb, the physician who served as the Academy's medical examiner. Dr. Webb was a respected member of Salem's medical community, a man in his 60s who had built his reputation on his discretion and his willingness to treat patients without asking uncomfortable questions. What Detective Ashworth discovered was that Dr. Webb's discretion came at a price. He had been receiving payments from St. Catherine's Academy that far exceeded what any legitimate medical practice would require. Dr. Webb's involvement with the Academy began in 1836, just 2 years after its founding. He had been called to treat a young girl who had suffered what Mother Superior Whitman described as a serious accident. The girl, who was about 14 years old, had injuries that were consistent with violent sexual assault. Dr. Webb treated her injuries and was paid handsomely for his silence. Over the years, Dr. Webb had been called to the Academy dozens of times to treat similar accidents. Young girls with injuries that told a clear story of abuse, others suffering from venereal diseases that should have been impossible for sheltered orphans to contract, and most disturbing of all, girls who required medical attention after what appeared to be botched abortions. Dr. Webb had kept detailed records of these treatments, partly out of medical necessity and partly as insurance against the day when his own involvement might be discovered. These records, which Detective Ashworth obtained through a warrant, paint a horrifying picture of systematic abuse spanning more than a decade. The medical records revealed that girls at St. Catherine's Academy were routinely subjected to physical and sexual violence. They were infected with diseases that could only have been transmitted through sexual contact with multiple partners. They suffered injuries that suggested they had been physically restrained and brutalized, and when they became pregnant as a result of their abuse, they were subjected to dangerous procedures that often left them permanently damaged or dead. But the records also revealed something else. Dr. Webb had been documenting the identities of the men who brought girls to him for treatment. These were not the Christian families who were supposedly adopting the girls from St. Catherine's Academy. They were wealthy merchants, politicians, judges, and religious leaders from Boston and beyond. Men who were paying premium prices for access to young victims. Among the names in Dr. Webb's records were some of the most prominent figures in Massachusetts society. There was Judge Harrison Cromwell, who had built his career prosecuting moral crimes while secretly patronizing the very establishments he condemned. There was Reverend Samuel Blackstone, whose sermons about the sanctity of childhood had made him famous throughout New England. There was even Mayor Robert Thornton of Boston himself, a man who had publicly praised St. Catherine's Academy for its Christian service. Detective Ashworth realized that he was looking at evidence of conspiracy that reached far beyond 3 women running a single institution. This was a network of powerful men who had used their positions to exploit the most vulnerable members of society, secure in the knowledge that their victims had no voice and no recourse. But as Ashworth delved deeper into the case, he made another disturbing discovery. Dr. Webb's records showed that many of the girls he had treated had subsequently disappeared from his care. Girls who had been severely injured or who had contracted dangerous diseases would be brought to him for treatment, but they would never return for follow-up care. When he inquired about their welfare, he was told that they had recovered completely and had been placed with new families. Ashworth began to suspect that girls who became too damaged or too dangerous to the operation were being permanently eliminated. But proving this would require finding evidence of what had happened to girls who had vanished without a trace. The answer came when Ashworth decided to investigate the physical structure of St. Catherine's Academy itself. Using his authority as a police detective, he obtained permission to conduct a thorough search of the building under the pretense of investigating reports of building code violations. What he found in the basement of the academy would provide the evidence he needed to bring down the entire operation. The basement had been divided into several sections, each serving a different purpose in the academy's true business. There was a workshop where girls were forced to produce goods that were sold to supplement the academy's income. There was a medical area where Dr. Webb had conducted his treatments away from prying eyes. And there was a section that had been designed specifically for the training of girls who were being prepared for placement with special clients. But it was the fourth section of the basement that provided the most damning evidence. Behind a false wall that had been carefully concealed, Detective Ashworth found a room that had been used as a primitive crematorium. The room contained the remains of an improvised furnace, along with fragments of human bone and teeth that had not been completely destroyed. Analysis of these remains would later reveal that they belonged to multiple individuals, all of them young females between the ages of 12 and 18. Some of the bones showed evidence of trauma that suggested violent death, while others indicated that the victims had been suffering from advanced stages of disease when they died. Detective Ashworth had found the final resting place of girls who had become liabilities to St. Catherine's Academy, girls who had been too damaged by their abuse to be profitable, girls who had threatened to expose the operation, girls who had simply outlived their usefulness. All of them had been murdered and their bodies destroyed to eliminate any evidence of their existence. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. In a hidden compartment near the crematorium, Ashworth found a ledger that detailed every transaction the Academy had conducted over its 13 years of operation. The ledger contained the names of clients, the amounts they had paid, and detailed descriptions of the services they had received. It also contained a complete record of the girls who had been retired from the operation, more than 40 young women who had been murdered when they were no longer useful. The ledger was signed by all three women: Mother Superior Victoria Whitman, Sister Margaret Collins, and Sister Agnes Murphy. But it was also signed by someone else, someone whose involvement in the operation had been carefully concealed until now. The fourth signature belonged to Father Patrick Ollie, the priest who had supposedly helped establish St. Catherine's Academy as a Catholic institution. Ollie, it turned out, was not a priest at all, but another criminal who had assumed a false identity to provide religious legitimacy to the operation. Detective Ashworth now had evidence of criminal conspiracy that involved not just 4 individuals, but a network of wealthy and powerful men who had used their positions to exploit vulnerable children. But bringing these criminals to justice would prove to be far more dangerous than gathering evidence against them. As Detective Ashworth prepared to present his evidence to the Massachusetts Attorney General, he began to understand why the St. Catherine's Academy operation had been able to continue for so long without detection. The network of clients who had patronized the Academy included some of the most powerful men in the state, men who had the resources and connections to make problems disappear. The first indication that Ashworth was in danger came when his superior, Captain Thomas Brennan, called him into his office for what was supposed to be a routine briefing on the case. Captain Brennan had always been supportive of Ashworth's work, but his demeanor during this meeting was noticeably different. He seemed nervous, distracted, and reluctant to discuss the details of the investigation. Detective Ashworth, Captain Brennan said, "Avoiding eye contact, I've been reviewing your reports on the St. Catherine's matter, and I'm concerned that you may be overreaching your authority. These are serious accusations you're making against respected members of the community." Ashworth was stunned. "Captain, the evidence is overwhelming. We have medical records, financial documents, physical evidence of murder. These women have been trafficking children for 13 years. Evidence can be misinterpreted." Detective Brennan replied carefully, "What appears to be criminal activity might simply be the result of poor record-keeping or unfortunate misunderstandings. I think it would be wise to proceed with extreme caution." That evening, Ashworth received a visit at his home from someone he hadn't expected to see: Judge Harrison Cromwell, whose name had appeared multiple times in Dr. Webb's medical records as a client of St. Catherine's Academy. Judge Cromwell arrived without warning, accompanied by 2 men who were clearly not court officials. He was polite but firm as he explained to Ashworth that the investigation into St. Catherine Academy was causing considerable concern among Boston's business community. Detective Ashworth, Judge Cromwell said, settling into a chair in Ashworth's parlor without being invited, "You've built a reputation as a thorough and dedicated officer of the law. That's why I'm confident you'll understand the delicate nature of the situation we're discussing. Your Honor, if you're here to discuss an active investigation, I should point out that this is highly irregular. Ashworth replied, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. Nothing irregular about community leaders taking a more interest in the welfare of our institutions. The judge said smoothly, St. Catherine's Academy has served this community for 13 years. The women who run it have devoted their lives to caring for orphan children. It would be a tragedy if unfounded. Accusations were to destroy their good work. Judge Cromwell leaned forward, his tone becoming more direct. I understand you've been talking to Dr. Webb about his medical practice. Dr. Webb is an old man, detective. His memory isn't what it used to be, and his records, well, medical records from that era can be difficult to interpret. It would be unfortunate if an elderly physician's failing memory were to cast doubt on the sterling reputation of a charitable institution. The message was clear. Dr. Webb would not be available to testify, and his records would not be admissible as evidence. But Judge Cromwell wasn't finished. I'm also told that you've been corresponding with a young woman named Emma Prescott. He continued, Miss Prescott has been through some difficult times recently, lost her position at the textile mill, fallen behind on her rent, developed something of a reputation for instability. It would be a shame if her troubles were to worsen because she allowed her imagination to run away with her. Ashworth felt a chill run down his spine. Are you threatening Miss Prescott, Your Honor? Not at all, Detective. I'm simply observing that young women in precarious circumstances often find their situations deteriorating rapidly. Miss Prescott will be wise to focus on her own problems rather than involving herself in matters that don't concern her. Judge Cromwell stood to leave, but he paused at the door. Detective Ashworth, you're a smart man. Smart enough to recognize when you're facing a situation that's beyond your control. There are forces at work here that you don't fully understand, and people who won't hesitate to protect their interests. I'd hate to see a dedicated officer like yourself become a casualty of his own overambition. After Judge Cromwell left, Ashworth sat in his parlor for a long time, considering his options. He knew that he was facing conspiracy that reached far beyond what he had initially imagined. The men who had been patronizing St. Catherine's Academy weren't just wealthy clients. They were judges, politicians, and business leaders who controlled the very institutions that were supposed to ensure justice. But Ashworth also knew that he might have one advantage. The criminals had become overconfident. They had operated for so long without consequences that they believed themselves untouchable. That overconfidence might be their downfall. The next morning, Ashworth made a decision that would put his own life in jeopardy. Instead of backing down from the investigation, he decided to accelerate it. He would gather his evidence and present it directly to the press, bypassing the legal system that had been compromised to secure the safety of the people who had helped him. He sent a message to Emma Prescott, warning her that she was in danger and advising her to leave Boston immediately. He also approached Dr. Webb and urged him to turn over all of his records before Judge Cromwell could have them destroyed. Dr. Webb, terrified by the visit he had received from the judge's associates, agreed to cooperate with Ashworth, but only under specific conditions. He would provide copies of his records, but he would not testify publicly. He was too old and too frightened to risk becoming a target of conspiracy he had helped to enable. As Ashworth prepared to expose the truth about St. Catherine's Academy, he realized that he was racing against time. The people he was investigating had already begun to take steps to protect themselves, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their secret. The question was whether Ashworth could gather enough evidence to bring them down before they succeeded in silencing him permanently. The answer would come sooner than he expected, and in a way that would test every assumption he had made about the case. Just when Detective Ashworth thought he understood the full scope of conspiracy, he received information that would change everything he believed about St. Catherine's Academy. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what Detective Ashworth was about to uncover, because the truth about those 24 missing girls was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The revelation that would expose the true horror of St. Catherine Academy came from the last person Detective Ashworth expected, Sister Margaret Collins herself. On the night of November 15th, 1847, Sister Margaret arrived at Ashworth's home in a state of complete terror. Her nun's habit was torn and stained with blood. Her face bore fresh bruises, and her eyes held a wild look of someone who had seen death approaching. "Detective Ashworth," she gasped as he opened his door. "They're going to kill me. They know I've been talking to you, and they're going to kill me just like they killed the others." Ashworth quickly brought her inside and secured the house. As Sister Margaret sat in his parlor, trembling with fear and exhaustion, she began to tell him a story that revealed the true nature of the women who had been running St. Catherine's Academy. "My name isn't Margaret Collins," she said, her Irish accent now completely gone, replaced by the flat tones of rural Massachusetts. "It's Martha Caldwell, and I'm not a nun. None of us are nuns, detective. We're criminals, murderers who have been using that academy to destroy children for 13 years. The woman who had called herself Sister Margaret began to tell Ashworth the real story of St. Catherine's Academy. She, Victoria Whitman, and Agnes Murphy had met in the Massachusetts State Prison for Women in 1833, where they were serving sentences for various crimes, fraud, theft, and in Murphy's case, the murder of her own husband for his insurance money. "Victoria was the smartest of us," Martha continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She had been educated at a real, finishing school before her family lost their money. She knew how to talk like a lady, how to carry herself, how to convince people that she was something she wasn't. When we were released in early 1834, she came to us with a plan. The plan had been audacious in its simplicity. Victoria Whitman had learned that there were 3 actual nuns: Sister Catherine Morrison, Sister Mary Frances, and Sister Teresa Walsh, who had been traveling from Ireland to establish a Catholic orphanage in Massachusetts. The nuns were traveling alone, carrying the documentation and funding they needed to start their new mission. Victoria arranged to meet them when their ship docked in Boston. Martha said, her voice breaking with the memory, "We told them we were devout Catholic women who wanted to help with their mission. We offered to guide them to Salem, where they planned to establish their academy. The 3 genuine nuns never made it to Salem alive. On a remote stretch of road between Boston and Salem, Victoria Whitman and her accomplices murdered the women they were supposed to be helping. They took their documents, their money, and most importantly, their identities. We buried them in a field outside of Marblehead," Martha whispered. Victoria said that dead nuns couldn't contradict our story. "We burned their real clothing and put on their habits. When we arrived in Salem, we became Sister Victoria, Sister Margaret, and Sister Agnes. The false documentation had been easy to maintain because few people in Protestant Massachusetts were familiar with Catholic hierarchy and procedures. The women's claims about their background and authority were accepted without question, and their mission to help orphan children was welcomed by the community. For the first year, we actually tried to run a legitimate orphanage," Martha continued. "We thought we could take the money we had stolen from the real nuns and build a life for ourselves. But Victoria had bigger plans. She realized that there was much more money to be made from the girls than from simply caring for them. The transition from legitimate orphanage to trafficking operation had been gradual. It began when a wealthy Boston merchant approached Victoria Whitman about adopting a girl, but made it clear that his intentions were not paternal. Victoria realized that there were men willing to pay extraordinary sums for access to young, vulnerable girls who had no family to protect them. Victoria started by identifying girls who wouldn't be missed, Martha explained. Girls who had no relatives, no friends. Outside the academy, no one who would ask questions if they disappeared. She would tell the community that these girls had been placed with wonderful families, and everyone believed her because she was Mother Superior Victoria Whitman, a devoted servant of God. But the operation had grown far beyond what Martha had ever imagined it would become. What had started as selling a few girls to wealthy perverts had evolved into a sophisticated network that supplied children to brothels throughout New England. The academy became a recruitment center, a training facility, and ultimately a disposal site for girls who were no longer useful. The basement workshop wasn't for teaching domestic skills, Martha said, her voice filled with horror at her own memories. It was where we broke them, where we taught them to submit, to obey, to accept that their bodies weren't their own anymore. Girls who resisted were beaten until they learned compliance. Girls who tried to escape were made. Examples of Martha described a systematic process of psychological and physical abuse designed to strip the girls of their will to resist. New arrivals were isolated from the other girls and subjected to increasingly severe punishments until they accepted their fate. Girls who showed particular beauty or refinement were given special training that prepared them for the most wealthy and demanding clients. Victoria had lists, Martha said, lists of clients and their specific requirements. Some men wanted girls who looked like their own daughters. Others wanted girls who reminded them of their dead wives. There were men who paid extra for girls who would cry, and men who paid extra for girls who wouldn't. The most disturbing revelation was what happened to girls who became pregnant, contracted diseases, or simply aged out of their usefulness. Dr. Webb's treatments had been attempts to maintain the girls' value as commodities. But when those treatments failed, the girls were eliminated. Victoria called it retirement. Martha said, the euphemism sounding obscene in the context of child murder. Agnes would take them down to basement, and they would never come back. At first, Victoria told me they were being sent to other institutions, but I knew that wasn't true. I could smell the smoke from the crematorium, could see the ashes that Agnes scattered in the garden behind the academy. Martha estimated that more than 60 girls had been retired over the 13 years of the academy's operation. Some had been murdered outright when they became liabilities. Others had died from the abuse they suffered, and still others had been killed when they threatened to expose the operation. The 24 girls you're looking for, Martha said, they're not missing. They're dead. Every single one of them. Victoria kept a record of their names because she was proud of what she had built. She called them her greatest successes, girls who had generated the most money before they were eliminated. But Martha's most shocking revelation was about the scope of conspiracy. The network of clients wasn't limited to Boston or even Massachusetts. Victoria Whitman had established connections with similar operations throughout New England and New York, creating a regional network that treated girls like commodities. There are other places like St. Catherine's. Martha said Victoria was in communication with people running similar operations in Connecticut, Rhode Island, even as far away as Philadelphia. They would trade girls, share clients, help each other eliminate problems. It's not just one academy. Detective, it's dozens of them. Martha had finally decided to come forward because she had learned that Victoria and Agnes were planning to eliminate her. Her growing reluctance to participate in the most violent aspects of the operation had made her a liability, and she had overheard them discussing the best way to arrange her accident. I never wanted it to go this far, she said, tears streaming down her face. When we started, I thought we were just going to steal some money and disappear. I never imagined we would become what we became. I've helped murder children, detective. I've helped destroy dozens of innocent lives, and I can't live with it anymore. Martha offered to provide Ashworth with everything he needed to expose the operation, the location of the mass grave where the real nuns were buried, the names and locations of other similar operations, detailed records of clients and transactions, and most importantly, the location where Victoria Whitman kept her most incriminating evidence. Victoria keeps everything in a safe in her private quarters. Martha said financial records, client lists, photographs that clients paid extra for, correspondence with, other operations. She thinks it makes her powerful having evidence that could destroy so many important men, but it's also evidence that could destroy her. As Martha finished her confession, Ashworth realized that he was looking at the biggest criminal conspiracy in Massachusetts history, but he also realized that exposing it would be incredibly dangerous. The men who had been clients of St. Catherine's Academy would do anything to prevent their crimes from becoming public, and they had the resources to eliminate anyone who threatened them. The question was whether Ashworth could move fast enough to gather the evidence and present it to the public before the conspiracy could silence him and Martha permanently. The answer would determine not only whether justice would be served, but whether the girls who had died at St. Catherine's Academy would finally be remembered for who they truly were, victims of a system that had failed to protect them. Detective Ashworth knew that he had only hours before Victoria Whitman and Agnes Murphy realized that Martha had betrayed them. With Martha's help, he organized a raid on St. Catherine's Academy that would take place at dawn on November 16, 1847. He bypassed his own department, knowing that the conspiracy reached into the Boston police, and instead contacted the Massachusetts State Police and federal marshals who were not connected to the local network of corruption. The raid on St. Catherine's Academy revealed horrors that exceeded even Ashworth's expectations. In Victoria Whitman's private safe, investigators found detailed records of 127 girls who had been trafficked through the academy over 13 years. 68 of them had been murdered when they were no longer useful, including the 24 girls whose names would eventually give this case its enduring notoriety. The evidence also revealed the scope of the client network. The list included not just Massachusetts officials, but wealthy men from across New England and New York. Among them were 3 federal judges, 12 state legislators, 5 mayors, and dozens of prominent businessmen and religious leaders. The scandal would eventually reach as high as a member of Congress and a federal cabinet member. Victoria Whitman was arrested while attempting to flee to Canada with a suitcase full of gold coins and jewelry that had been payment from clients. Agnes Murphy was found in the basement of the academy, destroying evidence in the crematorium where so many girls had met their end. The false father, Ollie, had disappeared completely and was never found. The trials that followed were among the most sensational in Massachusetts history. Victoria Whitman, facing overwhelming evidence, maintained her innocence until the end, claiming that she had been running a legitimate orphanage and that any evidence to the contrary had been fabricated by her enemies. She was convicted on 68 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Agnes Murphy attempted to claim that she had been coerced by Whitman, but the evidence showed that she had been an enthusiastic participant in the operation's most violent aspects. She was convicted on 43 counts of murder and also sentenced to death. Martha Caldwell, in exchange for her cooperation, received a sentence of life in prison. She would spend the remaining 32 years of her life in the Massachusetts State Prison for Women, where, ironically, she became known for her work helping other female prisoners learn to read and write. Dr. Webb, faced with the choice between cooperation and prosecution, provided detailed testimony about his role in the conspiracy. His medical records were crucial in establishing the pattern of abuse and murder. He was convicted of accessory to murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, but died of a heart attack less than 2 years into his sentence. The investigation into the client network proved more problematic. Many of the men named in Victoria Whitman's records had the resources to hire the best lawyers and the connections to influence the legal process. Some fled the country, others destroyed evidence, and still others simply denied any involvement despite overwhelming proof of their crimes. Judge Harrison Cromwell was found dead in his study 3 days before he was scheduled to testify, apparently having committed suicide rather than face public disgrace. Several other clients met similar fates, leading to speculation that they had been murdered to prevent them from implicating others in the conspiracy. In the end, Only 12 of the more than 50 clients identified in the records were successfully prosecuted. The others escaped justice through a combination of wealth, influence, and reluctance of authorities to pursue cases that would embarrass prominent members of society. The physical evidence of the crimes was undeniable. Excavation of the basement. Crematorium revealed bone fragments and personal effects belonging to dozens of victims. The mass grave outside. Marblehead yielded the remains of the 3 genuine nuns, along with several other unidentified victims. The academy. Building itself was destroyed by an angry mob before authorities could stop them. Emma Prescott, whose suspicions had helped expose the conspiracy, was initially hailed as a hero, but she found that her newfound fame came with a terrible price. Many people blamed her for destroying the reputations of prominent men, and she received death threats from those who believed she should have remained silent. She eventually moved to California, where she lived under an assumed name until her death in 1891. The case of St. Catherine's Academy led to significant reforms in how orphanages and charitable institutions were monitored in Massachusetts. New laws required regular inspections, detailed record-keeping and verification of staff credentials. Similar reforms were implemented throughout New England as other states sought to prevent similar tragedies. But perhaps the most important outcome of the case was that it finally gave names and identities to girls who had been erased from history. The 24 girls, whose disappearance had initially puzzled investigators, were revealed to be Mary O'Brien, age 13, murdered in 1837 after attempting to escape. Sarah Thompson, age 15, killed in 1839 when she contracted tuberculosis. Catherine Murphy, age 12, beaten to death in 1840 when she refused to comply with a client's demands, and 21 others, ranging in age from 12 to 17, each with their own story of a life cut short by the cruelty of adults who should have protected them. A memorial was erected in Salem's Green Lawn Cemetery, bearing all their names, paid for by public subscription. The inscription reads, "In memory of the innocent victims of St. Catherine's Academy, may their names never be forgotten, and may their suffering never be repeated." Detective William Ashworth was promoted and eventually became chief of police in Boston, a position he used to continue investigating similar cases throughout New England. He never married and dedicated his life to protecting children from the kind of predators he had encountered at St. Catherine's Academy. He died in 1889, still carrying the guilt of not having discovered the conspiracy sooner. The building that had housed St. Catherine's Academy was never rebuilt. The land remained empty for decades, eventually becoming a small park where children could play safely. Local legend claims that on certain nights, visitors to the park can hear the sound of young voices singing lullabies, as if the spirits of the murdered girls were finally at peace. The case file for St. Catherine's Academy remains one of the most requested records in the Massachusetts State Archives. Researchers, journalists, and true crime enthusiasts continue to study the case, looking for answers to questions that may never be fully resolved. How many other institutions like St. Catherine's Academy operated without detection? How many powerful men escaped justice for their crimes? And how many other children suffered similar fates without anyone ever learning their names? What we do know is that the evil that flourished at St. Catherine's Academy was not supernatural or otherworldly. It was purely human evil perpetrated by people who chose profit over compassion, power over protection, and silence over justice. The real horror of this story is not that it involved ghosts or demons, but that it involved people who were supposed to be guardians and protectors. The 24 girls who never left St. Catherine's Academy finally found peace not through supernatural intervention, but through the courage of people like Emma Prescott and Detective Ashworth, who refused to let their deaths be forgotten. Their names are carved in stone now, permanent reminders that even the most vulnerable members of society deserve justice, protection, and remembrance. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors are often hidden behind facades of respectability and virtue. The most dangerous predators are not strangers. lurking in shadows, but trusted figures who use their positions of authority to exploit those under their care. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or could there have been even darker secrets that died with Victoria Whitman? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth is often more terrifying than any ghost story, and there are many more dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. See you in the next video.